Okay, service or retail and startup cost. Let's dive in. So what we will cover is what type of franchises and what they cost, and how you can see the exact breakdown of a startup cost. So most people know about the retail franchises with the physical location, right? McDonald's and Taco Bell and Jersey Mike's and predominantly these food ones that you see everywhere, right? And there are a lot of other retail-based franchises that are not in the food space as well. But a booming segment in franchising and the ones that people know the least about are usually service-based franchises. So what are some examples? So deciding on going service or retail is a really key decision, and we're going to talk about those examples in just a minute. Now, service, let's talk about that. Characteristics of the business. They are generally faster to get open, and they generally have lower cost to get started. So think about it. If you're opening up a business, a landscaping business, right? You don't have to wait to build out a location. All you need to do is get your vehicle, get your equipment, and you can start getting customers. Or if you buy a plumbing franchise or anything in the service space, right? And you're typically buying a territory with specific zip codes or population metrics. And many times it is specific zip codes. And generally speaking, service has the potential for higher profit margins. And you don't need expensive Class A real estate. If you don't know what Class A commercial real estate is, that's like a retail location. Your typical shopping centers that you go to that, have some of the better brands. Then there's Class B and lower classed commercial real estate where maybe they're not as good of shopping centers or have a lot of the lesser known type of businesses. But you may not need an office at all and may be able to operate from home for a while. Now, some service-based franchises, you may need to rent a warehouse or you may need to have some sort of industrial spot that you're leasing, etc. So deciding on going service or retail is a really, really key decision in your process. Let's talk about retail. Physical location with potential anchor tenants. An anchor tenant is a larger tenant that brings traffic to a shopping center. So think of Starbucks, think of your grocery store, think of any sort of big name where people are going to go to that shopping center to go to that store. And this could be a gym too. Generally, it takes longer to get open because you need to do a build out. You have to actually do construction. Construction is typically going to take at minimum 2 months. At minimum 2 months, let's call it maybe 6 weeks, but somewhere between 2 to 4 months in just the construction process. It's typically from signing your franchise agreement. It's typically going to take you about somewhere between 8 and 9 months to a year to actually get open after signing your franchise agreement. You'll typically need to sign at least a 5 to 10 year lease. So you're signing that lease saying, hey, we're committing to making those payments for a 5 to 10 year period. And retail generally has higher costs to get started because you have the cost of construction, right? And all of your equipment, et cetera, to get the space built out. And you may not have a protected territory, whereas in service-based, they're a little bit more specific because of the way that the business operates. And typically with retail, you can expect lower profit margins depending upon the type of business because there's just more cost and paying rent, which Class A real estate, as an example, our 1,100 square foot store in California, all in, we're paying originally about $4,500 a month for rent. And then typically commercial real estate increases by 3% each year. And then you have the cost of the property taxes or the insurance for the shopping center, what's called a common area maintenance, CAM. All those things can increase every year. So pretty quickly, we went from $4,400 a month to paying over $5,000 a month in rent. So think of it, if you're doing the same level of sales in a service-based location and you don't have a $5,000 a month rent cost, well, that's a major expense that's not there anymore. It's not the case with everything, but okay. So let's go into some examples of some of the franchises, what those startup costs look like. So I hope you're paying attention because we're going to dive into some numbers here. So this is franchise number 1, right? So this is a home service franchise, and this is what I was sharing with you in terms of the level of detail that franchises show, right? And so if we look at this, this is what you would see in the FDD in what's called item number 7. And so you'd be able to see everything. So you can see that the initial franchise fee is $49,000, $49,500. And so that's something that will be paid once you sign the franchise agreement. You can see that the total here to get open is between $84,000 and $110,000. What that means is that there are franchisees that were able to get up and running for as little as $84,800. And then there were franchisees that were able to get up and running for about $110,000 or so. And so these numbers may not be accurate to the penny, but it's an overall estimate. And then you can see the actual breakdown of where that money was spent. Travel and living expenses, tools and equipment, inventory on a vehicle. And some of this, and what you'll see is there may be asterisks and notations where in the FDD it gives you an explanation of what these annotations are for. But one of them, as an example, if there's a big range on vehicle, it could depend on if someone buys the vehicle outright and they pay a large sum of money to actually pay for it with their business loan or with cash, or if they finance it through a vehicle loan, right? And the cost is not reflected. You'll typically always see an amount allocated towards initial marketing expenses. You may go, whoa, $10,000, $15,000 towards marketing? That seems high. Well, marketing is the lifeblood of your business, right? If you don't market, you don't generate sales. And the other thing to consider is that in the startup costs, there's always going to be an allocation for additional funds. And so that money's not necessarily coming out of your pocket right now, but it is allocated for in the startup cost. And I would say there are some times where maybe you want to be more aggressive or more conservative, meaning you want to say, hey, I may need to have more than $10,000, $7,500 in terms of additional funds because, well, my business expenses probably aren't going to only be $2,500 a month, but it depends on the type of business and the way that you run the business. What's cool is it tells you how these are collected, when they are due, and to whom the payment is made. So again, just one of the really cool things about franchising. What other businesses can you go and look at where you get this level of transparency and really knowing what you're dealing with? So this is the franchise that we were just looking at. This is actually their item 19. So this is where they're showing what the revenues look like and what the sales look like for some of these territories. And so in every item 19, they will look different, right? But this is how they show it here. So you can see that I already noted, I did some of the math for you and noted that it has a $278,000 average. So if we think about that, right, if we go back and we see that, let's use the higher end when we're calculating that sales to investment ratio. So in a service-based franchise like this, in a sales to investment ratio of 3-to-1, you would want to see average sales of about $330,000, right? Because multiplying it by 3, that's what you would be looking for. So This has a little bit less than the sales to investment ratio that you would want to see. But that's the average, and then you can see how some of the other franchisees are doing. So what you can see here in the item 19 is that, okay, they are showing first the single territory franchisees only. So these are franchisees that have only bought one territory. Multi-territory franchisees are franchisees that have bought 2 or more territories. Why is it important to reflect these differently? Well, imagine where if they're showing the numbers by franchisee, and they show one franchisee does, let's say, 384 on average, but the other one does $1 million on average, and you go, whoa, what? How is one doing 384,000, the other one's doing $1 million? Well, the difference could be that the one doing $1 million has 2 territories. So what they're actually doing is 500,000 per territory. So it's something that's important to look at and be aware of as you're looking through the FDD and the item 19, is really diving into how those numbers are reported and reflected. I don't want to go into the weeds here. It's something that we go a lot deeper into in our Zero to Profitable franchise system and the due diligence, et cetera. This is really meant to give you an idea and so that you can have an understanding of how to find the numbers, how to look at them, et cetera, and again, calculate the sales to investment ratio. So we can see that they're reporting based off of 11 total franchisees, top half and the bottom half here. We can see the minimum revenue that those franchisees are doing. And then what we can see is we can see the average, right? So the average I took here by just these 2 numbers here. The difference between the median and the average is taking off the lowest performer and taking off the highest performer. So in case they're really skewing the numbers. So really the median is going to give you the most accurate representation. And so what we can see here is that for the top half of performers, the median is 338,000 in terms of performance. And for the bottom half, it's 157,000. And for multi-unit franchisees, you can see that a majority of their franchisees are multi-unit. Why? Because that's 26. These are 40 franchisees that are multi-unit and only 11 that are single unit franchisees. So it tells you a little bit about just the organization overall. And so what this doesn't say here is if they own 2, or if they own 3, or if they own 4, or if they own 5 territories, which would be a huge difference, right? Because maybe the person that does $3.5 million a year in sales, maybe they have 5 territories, whereas the person here may only have 2 territories, right? But again, you can get an idea of what those average look like. At this point, you don't really have enough information to really figure out if this is the right opportunity and what the average sales are, because again, you just see that it's by franchisee, not by territory. But I still wanted to break it down to you and show you what that looked like. Let's move on to the next one. So this is another franchise in the home services space. And you can see that their franchise fee ranges from $24,000 to $57,000. That's because they have 2 different types of programs that you can sign on as a franchisee. I won't dive into that here, but some franchises do have that, where they have a more simplified or pared down version. You can see where some of these startup costs play into. So this is a much lower cost franchise to get up and running. And so you can see that really a majority of the startup cost are the franchise fee, are the grand opening advertising, right? So grand opening advertising, and then the additional funds, right? So, and the total is between $53,000 and $100,000 to get that franchise open. And then you can dive into their average sales. So again, what I told you was that each franchise lists it differently. And so this is where, again, just, if you continue on in your franchise journey and then diving deeper into doing due diligence, these are some of the things that we dive into with our clients in Zero to Profitable Franchise, is a lot deeper into reading FDDs, Item 19s, how to then decipher this information on what's the franchisee validation calls, etc. But what's cool here is that you can see that they list it by time in business. And so what you can really see is, okay, in the first 12 to 24 months, they don't list the first 0 to 12, but you got a lot of newer franchisees in this system, right? And this was an older version. I think this is about a year old on their FDD here. But they're listing this by territory, which is good to know, right? They're not listing this by franchisee. So showing it here, they're listing this by territory. So what we now know is that even if one franchisee owns 3 territories, they are reporting based on each of those individual territories. And so we're seeing that the average gross sales was $250,000 in that first year to 24 months, right? I don't know why that happened. And we're seeing that the median was 229, so not too far off of it. And we're seeing that half of the people exceeded the median. The lowest performer did $48,000 and the highest performer did $628,000 in one territory. So a big question here is, you may ask yourself, well, what's the difference? And this will pop up a lot as you're looking at franchise opportunities, which is, how can one person do $48,000 and another one do $628,000? And that's what your job is to figure out during the due diligence process. As you're diving into the franchise, as you're talking to the franchisor, as you're on meetings with them, as you're doing franchisee validation calls, right? And so, but what we know is that there is a franchisee that is doing well with one territory, 628,000, right? And then again, we see it just scaled up by months. So 9 people that are open 2 years to 3 years. And we see that average now per territory increases, which is an overall good sign, right? We're seeing that, okay, well, they're experiencing growth between that 24 to 36 months. And, but the highest performer did 608,000. So that's interesting. Which is, so this person must have really hit a home run in that first year, right? And eventually this person will, next year, they will land on this side of the grid. So I'd be curious to see where this performer, if in the next FDD, how they land here, and if this number is higher on the next one. But you probably want to have all that time to make your decision, because you're not going to wait a year, right? And so on and so forth, right? So I think you get the idea with the numbers, and you can see ultimately that someone that's been in business for 5 years, the highest performer does $1.1 million in sales in one territory, right? So one of the things I'd be looking at is, why does this one do $230,000? But in terms of meeting the criteria, in terms of it's between $50,000 to $100,000 to get open, what's important to understand about this specific business is that this is actually gross sales, but the franchisee actually only gets a portion of this because of the way that this business is structured. Not going to dive into those weeds, but again, just reiterating, it's important to do your homework in this entire process. So let's go into example number 2, which is still in the home services space, but a little bit of higher cost, right? So this is a different franchise that has a very low franchise fee. You can see they have a franchise fee of only $19,000. Let's just call it 20 grand. But interesting how they do this. They have an initial territory fee of $70,000. So basically, and many franchises may not have what's called a territory fee at all. But in this particular franchise, this would be the equivalent to basically having a franchise fee that's $89,000. because most franchises don't have also a franchise fee and an initial territory fee. But let's keep diving in. And so as we look here, we see what these things cost, and you'll see that they do not list anything for office space or workspace because, one, it's not required in this specific business, and some people do have it. You can see here for vehicle, it ranges from $10,000 to $48,000, and this is going to be the difference of if someone's really buying the vehicle or if they're leasing it and then, let's say, wrapping it. So this is someone who may be leasing it or financing it, and so their actual out-of-pocket expenses are lower. This person's actually paying for it up front. And again, you can just see what some of these startup costs look like. Nothing crazy here. And then initial marketing, you can see how much they're asking you to spend there. And let's keep going. And so this specific franchise is between $140,000 to $211,000 to get open. Sometimes I don't realize I'm still holding onto the button. And then you can see that so they're a little bit more conservative on their 3 months of expenses, right? And I personally like when franchisors are more conservative, because to say that I only need $7,500 for 3 months of expenses, come on, man. My business expenses are probably going to be more than that, but they're pretty conservative here, which I like. And they clearly state that it does not include office or workspace. Now, if we go to their item 19 and see what their average are, now in this case, they do not show it by how long the territory has been open, but what they do is they show it by territory. So we can see that in 2021, the median, let's start with the median. So median, again, is taking away the lowest and the highest. And so the median in 2021 was 712, and then it actually declined in 2022 to 600, which is interesting to understand why that happened. This is home services, could have been what's called the COVID bump, where some of these franchises really crushed it in 2021 because people were home. This is specifically something that has to do with some upgrade features in the home. And so that's what would make sense, is seeing that that has now declined, something that was cyclical. And then you can see that, okay, as people scale to 2 territories, they're now averaging about $600,000 per territory. So that's something that's interesting to know. And then you have 3 territories. Now they're averaging around $800,000 per territory. At least that was the case, or that was the median. And then you can see the average is higher. The average is keeping in that low and high number. So when you think about it from an investment standpoint, on the other page, if we saw that was between $140,000 to $200,000. Let's just use that top end higher number, and then we use our sales to investment ratio, and we can see that, okay, 1 territory, if it cost me $200,000 to get open, I'm at a 3-to-1, right? So at $600K, that meets the 3-to-1 criteria there. And then they go deeper into some of the numbers and in terms of percentiles in their item 19. I'm not going to go over it in here, but it was interesting to see. And again, just seeing that you can see all those details. So let's jump into a higher cost example in the home services space. Okay, so this is a higher end example. And again, what you can see is that the initial fee depends really on the business. So in that case, $60,000 for this franchise. The one we just looked at before, remember they had the initial fee and then the territory fee. So it's basically $80,000. And again, you can look at some of these costs. This franchise then charges a tuition fee for their training, which is interesting. They also charge an opening package. So you'd want to see like, hey, what does that opening package include? Very interesting, but we're not doing deep due diligence here. We're just high level looking at the startup cost. Again, you can see the same pattern playing out with vehicles. So as you're thinking about the startup costs and looking at the startup costs, there are ways, I don't want to say to manipulate your startup costs, but to be cognizant of maybe how you can get open for a lesser amount but you don't want to skimp any corners here, right? And then licensing, certificates, permits, that's just going to depend on locality. Professional fees, usually going to be attorneys, depending upon if someone used one. In this case, this specific company has a good amount of fees. They have a technology fee. They have a call center fee. They have a local brand optimization fee, creative media fund fee. So you can see that this specific franchisor, they are collecting a good amount of money. And so you get an idea of, wow, this franchisor, they're asking for a lot to be paid to them. And it's something to really look at in the process as you're looking around at the franchises. Well, what am I getting for that? And is that something that's unique or different than other franchisors? You can see that the initial marketing is $20K. So they're saying, hey, you got to spend $20,000 upfront on marketing. You can see that this has a drone kit fee. And this is because this is a roofing company. And so they're saying, hey, that drone kit is going to be pretty expensive. And so you can see then accounting services fee. Looks like they want you to use their internal accounting company. And then they are saying, hey, let's put aside a good amount of money towards additional funds. So this specific franchise is between $215,000 to $320,000 to get open. And this is a home services franchise. So if we look at their item 19, they list it in a simplified version, but they're basically saying, hey, our top 50% is doing about 1.9 in sales. And so you don't know how long they've been open. You don't know if that represents multiple territories or if that's just per franchisee, per territory. We don't know here. But what we know is that with a $300,000 to get open, well, if we're doing a 3-to-1 ratio for home services, then we would want to be doing at least $900,000 per territory. So we have a pretty clear picture here of at least what some of the numbers in this business look like. Now let's take a look at retail. So item number 7. So again, item number 7 in the FDD, it's what we were just looking at. I just didn't screenshot the item 7 part before. We'll run through these pretty quickly, but you can see franchise fee here pretty low on this one. But you can see now in a retail location, leasehold improvements. That's going to be a lot of your build out, right? Improving the space. You're going to see that those numbers are much higher. They're non-existent in the service-based ones. You can see that the equipment's going to be higher, fixtures, signs, etc. Right? So a much different case here. And you're going to see that there's opening inventory here, etc. We won't go through all of the details, but we can take a look and see that the opening costs are between $286 and $400K. And this is generally going to be on the lower side for a retail-based location. They're just more expensive in general. And they have a very conservative additional funds of between $5,000 to $15,000 a month for the first 3 months of operation. So you can see how some of these franchisors can really, again, I don't want to say manipulate because it has a negative connotation to it, but they can really shift what that looks like in terms of startup costs. Because I would argue to say that the startup costs in this sort of business in a retail location, I would say should be probably $15,000 a month. So this should show between $15K and $45K for that number is what I would say that I think it should show. Now, this is a different franchise that has a little bit of higher cost. From a retail perspective, you can see that their tech and equipment package a little bit on the higher end, franchise fee on the higher end, training fees. It includes travel, lodging, food, other expenses while at training. Their real estate improvements, so that's the same thing as leasehold improvements, really, really big numbers there, some of those being very expensive. They're calculating the first 3 months of rent and the startup costs there. So that's a little bit of a buffer. And the reason why they're probably showing 3 months is some landlords may ask you for first and last and maybe 3 months up front because of security deposit. You got professional fees, some of those adding up really high here. So anyways, you can see that this an additional fund's only at $10,000, which is pretty crazy. And maybe they put it only at $10,000 because they may have buffers and in some of these other categories. But this is a really big range here. $367,000 to $1.4 million to get open. So this would require a lot of due diligence and talking to franchisees to understand like what's the average here, because that's just a really massive range. And we'll actually dive into what that franchise makes in terms of sales in one of the next modules. So again, as we run through here, we'll just go through. This is a franchise that is a kids entertainment and fun place, basically a trampoline park. And you can see that these are much higher, have much higher startup costs. Leasehold improvements are between $500,000 to $750,000. Just the trampolines and equipment is between $600,000 and $800,000, right? And then you can see that it ranges between $1.3 to $2.1 million to get that franchise open. So when you start looking at a 2-to-1 ratio, you're wanting to really see that the average sales in this franchise average between 2.5 to over $4 million is what you're going to want to see as the average. Okay, so that is the last of this module, and in the next module, we will dive a little bit more into funding and the way that funding works when you are looking at buying your franchise.